I have to also go live on Facebook, so just give me a minute. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Although we are very few people today, but I'm very glad to host this meeting. And with pleasure, I introduce Dr. Davina Vora and Dr. Salma Raheem. So Davina is a full professor of international business at the State University of New York at New Paltz. She received her PhD from the University of South Carolina. And prior to joining SUNY New Paltz, she also taught at the University of Texas at Dallas. She has held visiting scholar positions in various countries like Finland, Peru, and Thailand. She teaches international business, cross-cultural management, and global leadership courses at both undergraduate and graduate levels. She has led study abroad in Mexico, Spain, and Thailand. So Davina has a father from India and a mother from Germany. So her interests in cross-cultural management is not very surprising. Her major research interests span the areas of international management, organizational behavior, and strategy. And there are many other things which when she will speak, you will understand about her. And Salma is a lecturer in human resource management and organizational behavior. She completed her PhD at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the Department of Management. And her consulting and academic work focuses on social inclusion, multicultural individuals, the management of multicultural teams, the development of leadership and inclusive cultures for organizational diversity and intercultural training. So prior to joining academia, she worked as a management consultant in Middle East and also in India in the education as well as healthcare industry. So she is a fellow of Higher Education Academy UK, and she has won several teaching awards over the 2 decades. She has also been recently selected as one of the 100 Muslim women from Kerala, India, as a global initiative called Rising Beyond the Ceiling, which aims to identify women from the community to celebrate their unique achievements and as positive role models for future generations. And of course, Salma is also a member of the STEMPeers community. So with this, I welcome both of you again, and please go ahead and speak to us about what is cross-cultural management and how to ensure that our culture affect the workforces and everything.
All right, thank you very much. So I don't see myself, but hopefully if there is a video, you see me. This is Davina from SUNY New Paltz. So Salma and I are going to go back and forth with the presentation. The topic, as you know, is the STEMPeers community culturally competent for the global workforce? So you already heard a little bit about who we are, and then we have our project for STEMPeers, which we'll talk about. We'll also discuss the importance of intercultural effectiveness and results from the project we ran with STEMPeers. So you already got the basics of who we are from the wonderful introduction, so I'll just skip through this. So the study, basically, both Salma and I are people with Indian heritage. Salma became a member of STEMPeers. She was impressed by how STEMPeers was supportive, collaborative in the global space. And also we both know there's a need for soft skills in the STEM fields. And we thought, since we're both experts in cross-cultural management, perhaps we could help this group. So we reached out to Abhinav and the team and created a special project for STEMPeers, where we wanted to assess members with regard to their multiculturalism and their cross-cultural skills, as well as obviously to help STEMPeers members develop their soft skills. I also want to briefly mention, so the study was at my university at SUNY New Paltz. So even though I say we, the study technically is me, but obviously we work together. So the process, we began to have an online survey in 2 steps. First, with the core team members, we had them take it and give us feedback, and then we adapted it and sent it to the broad STEMPeers membership. There were 2 surveys. The first was survey 1 as a link to the Facebook site, which had certain questions about multiculturalism, its correlates, demographics. And then after a few weeks, we had survey 2 sent directly to people who were willing to complete a second survey, and that had outcomes related to multiculturalism. Then after we did the surveys for people that allowed us to contact them and completed both surveys, we shared both their individual and the STEMPeers group results on key intercultural skills. And we also had a webinar for participants where we talked about culture, intercultural effectiveness, and how this can be beneficial in the workplace. So now Salma is going to pick it up to talk a little bit more about intercultural effectiveness from our webinar, and we'll go back and forth on a couple of slides. So Salma, you can take it from here.
Yep, thank you, Davina, and thank you, Jasmina, for a lovely introduction to both of us. So as Davina mentioned, we were quite aware, I'm a member of the STEMPeers group, and I was quite excited to see the level of support, a lot of interaction that happens on the group every day. There's messages on there, everyone helping each other out. And I realized that there's a lot of space for people to learn from others who are in different parts of the world. And that kind of very much aligns with the kind of work that Davina and I do. So when we decided to put this project together, we wanted to focus on the fact that there are a lot of people within the group, or generally in the STEM space, where technically you're quite excellent, you have all the skills required, etc. But then when it comes to working with people from different parts of the world, this can be a little bit more challenging. So that is one of the reasons that we decided to put together this presentation. So Davina, we could have the next slide. So culture is a word that's, when we talk about intercultural effectiveness, the first thing to get a grip on is, what do we mean by culture? Culture is a word that's used in the colloquial in many different ways, whether you're talking about cultural wars or cultural values, and different ways that we understand the word culture. From an academic perspective, the way we view culture is that it's something that is shared by almost all groups, all members of a particular social group. These aspects are then passed on from generation to generation. And all the aspects of the culture then shape the values and the behaviors of the individuals of that social group. So it's very much how the values and the behaviors play out, which are shared between a specific group of people. Why is this important? Because, as we say in management, culture eats strategy for breakfast, so to speak. culture has many layers to it. So what we see at the top end, like in terms of, if you compare it to an iceberg, what you observe many times in terms of the food that we eat, or the clothes, or the festivals, these are the observable artifacts. They're very easily observable, they're tangible, you can see them, distinctions between them. But they are built off of the values and norms that are actually shared between these groups of people. So these are the widely accepted beliefs about what should be and what's the way things should happen and how people should behave and what should be going on in terms of how we must think as well as act. Oftentimes, when you talk to a group of people, they're not really conscious about where those ideas came from about how we should behave and how we should interact with one another. So these are what we call the underlying assumptions. They're often very much taken for granted. Often people don't really think deeply about why do we do the things that we do. For example, some people eat with their hands. Why? Why do we eat with our hands? Where did it come from? What was the norm around it? Why do we eat with a fork or a knife? How did that come up? Why do we do these things? So oftentimes everyday behaviors we don't think about, and that's what we mean by the underlying assumptions. But these underlying assumptions that then lead to the values and norms, and then that to the observable artifacts, have a lot of impact in the way we interact with each other. For example, in the next slide, Davina. For example, one of the ways that it can make a huge impact is actually at the national level. So the way we think or act can actually decide how much financial risk we're willing to take. So if you see culture as a part of, if you see language as a part of culture, the way language is constructed determines how we think about the past or future tense, and that it can have impact on the way that we actually have a propensity to save money. So there's some research from UCLA that's done by Professor Keith Chen, who's an economist. And what he finds is with languages that don't have the concept of future tense. So that most languages, well, some languages like English have a past, present, and future tense, whereas other languages don't have this concept of future. For example, Finnish and Mandarin. And there are actually quite a few countries around the world like this. But with social groups or groups of people that speak languages do not have a future tense, these communities generally save much better or at a higher rate than communities that don't. So if we take that at a country level, countries with similar economic and institutional settings actually show significant differences in saving behavior at the national scale. So Professor Keith Chen studied OECD countries, and he finds there's a difference between 45% to 10% in the savings rate. And actually that language difference makes a 5% difference in terms of the GDP, in terms of saving rates between countries. So that's financial behavior just based on part of culture, and that too at the national level. If you look at justice perceptions, the way we feel things are fair or unfair, there's a lot of cultural influence in that. So when we study justice, there are three types of justice that we study, perceptions of justice. One is called interactional justice, the second is procedural justice, and the third is distributive justice. With interactional justice, we're looking at how we perceive fairness in interpersonal relationships, how people are treated back and forth between one another. In procedural justice, we're bothered about the fairness of the process. Is it fair and how outcomes are eventually achieved? With distributive justice, it's the distribution of the outcomes. For example, is everybody getting paid the same for the same job, which is exactly the opposite of the pay gap. We find that in communities, for example, with communities in America and in Japan, interactional justice was one of the biggest components in whether people determined there was overall fairness in an organization, whereas distributive justice was actually related to overall fairness, more among Chinese and Koreans rather than Americans or Japanese, whereas procedural justice was equally valued by all groups. In communities where there's greater value placed on materialism, distributive justice is much more important than the other aspects of justice. And that's what we found, that's what the authors in this study found in their Chinese and Korean samples versus their American and Japanese samples. So in that sense, if you're talking about working together as a group and you have a mix of these individuals and you're talking about a process and how things should be done, that means the values that people hold, the cultural values that people hold will decide whether people in that group think it's fair or not. So these are two examples of how culture can make a difference in our everyday lives. Can I have the next slide, Davina?
Yep. So I'll just briefly talk about this slide. So this is a summary of some major frameworks that discuss culture at the national level. So Hall, back in the 1950s, his work is used a lot in intercultural communication. Kluckhohn and Stradbeck were some anthropologists. Hofstede and Trumpenaar is more in the business context, along with Globe. There are others, such as the World Values Survey, Schwartz. So there are many, many different dimensions of culture. And when we talk about culture, this is typically what we mean is usually the values. It's relevant when we're talking about culture to note that this is often what we mean. And also across multiple frameworks, the two most validated dimensions are individualism, collectivism, and power distance. So basically the two aspects of culture that across various frameworks seem to exist in many countries is the idea of, are you more independent, more individual focused? Are you more interdependent, more group focused, individualism, collectivism? And power distance, which is also called egalitarianism, also called hierarchy, depends on which framework you're using. But basically, do you believe that it's normal to treat people differently based on status? What that status is can vary, the basis of status can vary, but basically, is it a more egalitarian society where you treat everybody pretty much the same? Or do you treat people differently based on their status? So, an example we often use is it typical to use a lot of titles, or do you just call everybody by their first name? So we just wanted to mention that when we talk about culture.
So we've seen what we've understood now what culture is. We can see how culture then shapes things at the national level, our behavior at a national level, our understanding of justice, and how we've looked at how it's been studied across, comparing different cultures between different countries. But then what happens when we put people from different parts of the world together in a team? So that's what we're gonna look at next. In terms of our upbringing, these implicit or underlying assumptions, they shape the way we view others and the decision-making that we take, especially in terms of our judgment and understanding of others. So we have lots of these underlying assumptions and biases and understandings of one another. For example, the illusion of asymmetric insight. This is a cognitive bias where we perceive other people's knowledge. We think our knowledge of others is better or more accurate than their knowledge of themselves, right? So I know what you're doing better than you claim that you know what you're doing. You're doing it because of this XYZ and I know that. A second error, for example, is fundamental attribution error. So in this particular type of error, what we're predispositioned to do is we're predispositioned to assume that the other person is doing what they're doing because they have an inherent individual characteristic. There's something about them that motivates them to do a certain particular thing, and it's got nothing to do with the situation they find themselves in. Having said that, then we start to stereotype people. We have an idea that, oh, those people are like that, they do things that way, and that's because their character's like that. And then we start to generalize all the people that come from that kind of space or class or group, they're all like that. So that's how we then move on to stereotyping. If we put a value to the different types of groups we then start to create, then we start to other. So people in that group are others and we are special. So they're different, we are different. And then there's now a sense of hierarchy. There's value systems being placed on these different groups. Homophily is a general tendency to stick to people you're comfortable with. So you have a tendency to interact with people who are more like yourself. And then this eventually leads to things called in-group and out-group formation. So those who are similar on certain ways of thinking or belief systems or values or align, they all tend to be one group and everybody else is some other out group. And this is a special group that we are in because of course we're wonderful. And then the other group is somehow not as good as we are. And that's the out group. So this happens quite often, especially on the bits of the differences that we see as visual, if you remember that iceberg. But let's just watch this little video to see whether that really holds true.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark. All that we share.
So while that was an advertisement specifically for a TV station in Denmark, it quite hits exactly what we've been trying to say in this presentation as well. That oftentimes we do differentiate each other on superficial characteristics that we see, those visible aspects of culture, for example. So how do we then, if we have a tendency and our predisposition is to have these biases where we differentiate people and put them into boxes, how then do we attempt to learn and understand from each other so that we can work together when we bring the best minds in the scientific space to come together to work on a project? And so that brings us on to the next slide. Well, research has a lot of things to say about how we can bring about that intercultural effectiveness when we have a very multicultural team working together. The first thing is to ensure that there is contact, so we don't end up othering or misunderstanding the values and systems of other people. So the first and foremost thing is, just like you saw in that advertisement, instead of people sticking to particular categories on superficial aspects, finding ways to bring people together. And when you have that one-on-one individual contact with another person who might be different from you visibly, it does help to reduce that intergroup prejudice between one another. In fact, there's quite a lot of extensive studies to show how important it is to actually step out of your comfort zone, step out of the social circle that you're part of, that you're comfortable with, and to mix with people from other parts of the world. But it's really important that in the workspace, especially, that 6 conditions have to be met to make sure that this works well. The first one is that there should be equal status between the different groups of people that are meeting together. You need to be coming together for the purpose of cooperation and to achieve a common goal. There has to be therefore a structure within the organizational setting, or either laws or customs or policies or procedures that support that coming together on an equal footing. There needs to be also opportunities for personal acquaintance. So it's one thing to spend time working with one another, but also downtime or time away from work where you get to actually know each other at a personal level. And of course, when that leads to intergroup friendships, it's even better. So these are the 6 conditions which need to be met when you work in a multicultural context to ensure that you can break down any type of intergroup prejudice between the various groups. So what does work at various levels? For example, at the individual level, if you want to engage with people from different parts of the world, what can you do? First and foremost, we have to admit that all of us have our individual biases, our upbringing from whatever conditioning that we've had, and oftentimes they're implicit and we don't even realize it. So the first thing is to have that awareness about yourself and understanding of others. So that does require stepping out of your comfort zone. So 2 aspects of the research that looks into these areas is cultural intelligence and cosmopolitanism. At the team level, that ability to be flexible in your behavior and adaptable, especially to the cultural context of the team, without pretending about who you are. So there has to be a level of authenticity. So one aspect of that is behavioral cultural intelligence, what we study in the literature. Another aspect of this behavior is called code switching, again, something that we study quite often in the intercultural literature. Also at the team level, what you need to have that environment, as we mentioned earlier, that type of inclusive environment where there's transparency in how people are treated. So everyone knows there's a sense of justice, that the rules and policies apply for everybody, and there's no perception of discrimination. At the organizational level, there needs to be opportunities for cultural bridging. So how can we teach each other about what the differences are? How can we mediate between one another to break down any misunderstandings? And of course, it really, really helps if you're multilingual and you can speak the languages of the people within that group. That way it helps to translate whatever the norms are and the nuance of the things that people are trying to say with one another. So these are the core areas that are generally studied when we try to understand how to bring multicultural members together in a group and work together as a team.
So that leads to the study that we conducted with STEMPeers. So we studied a number of those topics that Salma just mentioned: individualism level, multiculturalism, cultural intelligence, CQ, cosmopolitanism, and cultural bridging at work and in general. I'm going to talk about each of these constructs as well as some of the findings. So when we talk about individual level multiculturalism, we're talking about the extent to which an individual has knowledge, identification, and internalization of more than one culture. So for example, an Indian American, right? A Chinese Canadian, they have different cultures that are a part of them. And the components here are knowledge. So basically you have explicit knowledge where you can express it in words or write it down, right? Codified knowledge, it's sometimes called. And also tacit knowledge, you just happen to know, but it's difficult perhaps to state. So you have knowledge of a society's values, norms, beliefs, behaviors, and languages. Identification is you feel a sense of connection with that group and you value that membership. So you see yourself as being an American, you see yourself as being an Indian. Internalization is where you adopt the society's cultural values, assumptions, beliefs, and practices as your own. So it's not just that you know them or you identify with the group, but instead, oh, they value this and I value this as well. I have this assumption as well. And what this means in terms of implications, basically, if you have multiculturalism, right, if you are, sometimes it's called a multicultural or bicultural individual, this tends to be associated with being more adaptable to other cultures, having intercultural skills, which relates to bicultural competence, where you can interact effectively with people of different cultures. You have what's called attributional and cognitive complexity. So basically complex causal reasoning, you better understand why a culture does what it does. You also can make links and see the legitimacy of competing viewpoints. Cultural intelligence, I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. You also tend to be more creative, more innovative, have more social capital. So these networks of relationships between different people that can give you certain benefits. Cultural intelligence is an individual's capability to function and manage effectively in culturally diverse settings. There are different measures and dimensions of cultural intelligence. One of the most used is Ang et al. And there are 4 components or dimensions. One is metacognitive CQ, right? So this is basically processes you use to understand culture. Cognitive CQ, you know about the norms, practices, and conventions of different cultures. Motivational CQ, you are able to direct energy towards, you're motivated basically to learn about different cultures and how to function in different situations where there are cultural differences. And then behavioral CQ is you're able to exhibit appropriate behaviors and to communicate effectively across cultures, sort of adopting these different communication norms. So CQ has been suggested and found to relate to a lot of different things. Some of these are specific dimensions and some of these are CQ as a whole. So metacognitive CQ relates to reduced stereotyping. Salma talked about stereotyping earlier. A couple of these, more cultural understanding, better cross-cultural communication. Again, you see adaptability, flexibility, cross-cultural friendships, trust, and enhanced multicultural group functioning. So you can see how cultural intelligence can be very useful when working in intercultural settings and across diverse teams. Similarly, cosmopolitanism relates to a willingness to engage with others and having some competence in doing so. So it's a bit related to cultural intelligence, but it is seen as a different construct. So basically, are you willing to interact with others? This would suggest you're open, you want to form relationships. And are you actually able to do this? And if so, that suggests adaptability, flexibility, this kind of thing, which can relate to cross-cultural understanding, friendship, trust, reduced relational conflict. So there are 2 main types of conflict that are discussed in the literature. Relational conflict relates to relationships, right? And then there's task-related conflict where you disagree on how to do a task. So the relational conflict tends to be more detrimental. So we would like to have less relational conflict, less personalized conflict, if you will. And then also for cosmopolitanism, probably you'll have better multicultural group functioning. And then finally, cultural bridging. So this relates to behaviors that individuals engage in to try to help to improve intercultural collaborations, typically in a team setting, but it can be in other settings as well. And again, there are various components. So facilitating relates to giving advice to others about culture. So for example, I'm an Indian American, I'm talking to my American boss and I can explain, what this means that these Indians are doing this, and perhaps this could be the reason for it in terms of the norms, values, assumptions, etc. Mediating, supporting others to address conflicts. So basically acting like a mediator, trying to help both sides understand what's happening. Translating, communicating with others in different languages. So using that linguistic skill to try to bridge across people. Empathic comfort, basically you have empathy, you comfort others, you provide them support, you have some emotional sensitivity, and this can help to overcome some negative emotions. And then integrating, basically you're trying to foster an inclusive environment, drawing upon people's different skills, knowledge, etc. So bridging should be related to cross-cultural understanding, better conflict resolution, fewer cross-cultural communication issues, more positive attitudes, inclusiveness, also trust, again, multicultural group functioning. It relates to more satisfaction, probably reduced turnover in a company setting because people are happier, more satisfied in the organization, and also better performance because again, you're drawing upon different skills, knowledge, and people feel more comfortable and supported. So those were the main variables we're going to be talking about. The results for the STEMPeers group. So I already talked about how the study was organized. So here's the summary of what we found for the people that took the survey. So in terms of multiculturalism, keep in mind this is on a 7-point scale. So obviously the STEMPeers group, for those who took the survey, are pretty high on this. The highest was knowledge. So basically for people's own culture, they knew about the values, norms, beliefs, etc., of that culture. The lowest was internalization. This is expected because, again, internalization is having the values, norms, etc. of the culture as your own, adopting them as your own. So this is sort of expected because it's a lot easier to know something and it's a lot faster to learn something than it is to adopt it in your own, to internalize it as part of yourself. In terms of cultural intelligence and cosmopolitanism, for the combination of these, cosmopolitanism was extremely high. So this suggests that for those people who took our survey, members are very willing to engage with other cultures and can do so somewhat effectively. In terms of cultural intelligence, motivational cultural intelligence was the highest. So again, for the folks who took the survey, they are very motivated to learn about different cultures, to learn about how to interact effectively in diverse settings. But interestingly, the cognitive cultural intelligence was lower, so they didn't have as much knowledge as the norms and practices and conventions of different cultures. So while they're motivated to learn, they don't necessarily have a high level of knowledge of various cultures.
So yeah, thanks, Davina. So studies about cultural intelligence, especially because it's so important in international business, there are various different types of scales and massive studies that we have done. So just like we've done a study for STEMPeers, we wanted to share another particular study with a different kind of scale to explain to you how things look at a global level. So if you can look at the study done by Thomas and colleagues, and this was published in JIBS in 2015. So here, as you can see, there's 3,500 people surveyed, and what we're trying to emphasize here is the value of the importance of the concept of cultural intelligence being really, really important to understanding how you can interact with one another. And we strongly encourage all of you guys to consider what is your CQ level, understand what scales are available. You can always get in touch with us, but to see how this plays out on a global scale as well.
And I just wanted to note, when Salma mentioned JIBS, that's the Journal of International Business Studies, which is the top journal in international business. Okay, so then for cultural bridging, so there are going to be a lot of circles here in a minute, so I apologize if it gets to be a little much. So we broke it up into facilitating and mediating, etc., cultural bridging at work, so in the work context, and then in general outside of work, because that hasn't been done before, but it occurred to us that probably there will be differences as to what you do in a work context versus outside of work. So looking at both of these together, the highest scores across both contexts was empathic comfort at work. And so here, this basically is telling us, again, the STEMPeers members who took the survey do tend to comfort others. They're sensitive to others to help overcome negative emotions in both work contexts and outside of work. Where they were consistently low had to do, and again, this is on a 7-point scale, so it's still pretty well, right? But lower was mediating, and again, this was in both contexts. So not necessarily actively supporting others to address conflict as much as other aspects of bridging. So it seems like that could be an area to possibly improve. Another thing I wanted to highlight were differences in the two contexts. So facilitating at work was a bit higher than facilitating in general. So you tend to give advice to others about cultural differences at work more so than outside of the work setting. And this also relates to the general cultural bridging, which is the average of all those dimensions. So overall, for the STEMPeers members who took our survey, more bridging happened at work than in general outside of work. So those are some of the basics in terms of the scores of what we found for the folks that took our survey. And now Salma will talk a little bit more about the implications.
So we've looked at all these various concepts that will really help in how we can bring people together. You've seen some raw scores that have been calculated for the group. for the sample group that we had for STEMPeers. What does this therefore tell us about what we need to do going forward? First of all, to kind of recap the overall implications from the study, we find that STEMPeers members who participated have quite high average values on multiculturalism, on CQ, and cosmopolitanism, and cultural bridging. So overall, there is evidence of some level of intercultural effectiveness from the sample that we studied. Having said that, the higher scores were seen for motivational CQ. So this means members of the study were interested in understanding about other cultures, cosmopolitanism, they were open and willing to learn and adapt to different cultures, and they were very empathetic towards bringing together people from different backgrounds. However, where we saw lower scores was in cognitive CQ. This is actual knowledge about different cultures, and the bridging component, and from the cultural bridging component, the component of mediating. So there was, in general as well, in terms of cultural bridging, overall in the general context, the scores were lower than how people were behaving at work. What does that mean going forward for this group? Given the lower scores for cognitive CQs, one of the things that STEMPeers members probably need to consider before you start to embark on a project where you're working with other people from different parts of the world is to actually take an effort to learn about what are the cultures, what are the norms, what are the practices and conventions in other cultures, especially in terms of communication, how to be polite. And we saw all of those other dimensions like power distance, all of these things. So before considering an international assignment or an international career or working with an intercultural group, consider to spend a little bit of time, not just making sure about your technical skills, but having knowledge about the people that you're going to be working with, right? This actually really needs to be prioritized if you want to interact effectively on a daily basis. Given the lower scores on cultural bridging component of mediating, this is really, really important because every group, every team that comes together, whatever their cultural background, there's always going to be some sort of differences or some sort of difference of opinion or different ways of doing things. But given the additional variation with culture, if you don't understand how to address conflict with different people from different parts of the world, it's going to be kind of difficult to get along with one another and get the best out of that team. So it'll be useful to get some training or understand or read up or work on how you can actively support others in addressing conflict between people from different parts of the world. So there are, there could be very different ideas about how conflict should be reduced, so you need to keep that in mind, but developing skills in this area will really facilitate development, not just as an individual for yourself, but also the way the team works together. Reducing your own personal stress. And these kinds of key skills are really important for your career advancement, especially if you're looking for leadership opportunities in the future. In terms of the lower scores on cultural bridging overall, that is in general outside of the work, it'll be really useful if STEMPeers members could recognize that there's a lot of impact on family adjustment in this area. So, for example, one of the key findings that we find in international business is when people go abroad to work, especially if they're taking their family along, the biggest component that's a detriment to being happy and working abroad is how well your family adjusts. So if your family is not adjusting well in the general consensus, then you're working abroad, and that whole entire thing is very difficult to, there's a great level of dissatisfaction in that foreign working context. So the ability to adjust outside of work is really important, not just for you, but also the happiness of your family. And developing these sets of skills in building that supportive network, and you'll get a bit more of a supportive network in the communities that you're going to be a part of. It's really good for if you have children, for your children, their activities, friends that they make, your own social circle, your partner, especially when you are in a very new environment. So these were some of the areas that we thought would be useful for the STEMPeers group to consider as part of developing the overall intercultural effectiveness based on the results that we found for the project that we did for STEMPeers. And with that, we have finished with our presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Davina and Salma. It was wonderful listening to you guys. So, Motoshi, do you have any questions? You were the only participant. Do you have any questions?
I know, yeah. Davina and Salma, it was a very a nice conversation. So you talked about egalitarian and hierarchy. So do you see any trend in today's world how organizations are trying to be? Are they trying to be, as usual, very hierarchical, or are they trying to be more egalitarian now?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I'll see if Salma has something she'd like to add. So I want to emphasize that when we were talking about culture, we were talking about national culture. So that's the country level. So basically, overall, on average, what do Americans think? What values do Americans have? Do Brazilians have? Do Indians have? Do Germans have? Right? In terms of this, so it's a national level construct, if you will. And you can have organizations. So organizational culture is considered sort of a separate field than national culture. That being said, organizational cultures sometimes align with the national cultures and sometimes don't. So with respect to organizational culture, my understanding is that it tends to vary a lot by the organization and also the type of organization it is. And Salma might have more insight in this. I don't do a lot of research on organizational culture per se, but my guess is that in smaller firms and more high-tech firms, and this has been shown with a lot of entrepreneurial firms, it tends to be a little bit more egalitarian than in larger firms, but I don't know if there's a general trend in one way or another. Salma, I don't know if you have anything to add or more insights on that.
Yeah, so just to add to what Davina has said, and thank you for that question, sorry if I mispronounced your name, but yes, so definitely the dimensions that we talked about are at the national level, and the research does also appreciate that there may be variations at the national level. At the organizational level, it depends on the size of the firm, and it depends on the strength of the national culture as well, and it also depends on the level of globalization of that organization. So for example, very global MNCs might be more egalitarian and not be as hierarchical. Maybe more domestic firms will reflect what is the values within that particular nation. So, but these three things generally impact the level along that particular dimension. Having said that, is there preference within a multicultural team though? Individuals will have different levels of preference. So what happens at the team level can actually change within the same organization. So there may be certain teams which are more bothered about the power distance or more bothered about individualism or collectivism, depending on the membership of that team and that leader. So you will have variations sometimes within the same organization. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So I asked Abhi if he has a question, and he came up with a question. He asked, what should we be teaching our kids who are going to enter the workforce in the next 5 years?
Davina, you want to take that first?
That's a big question.
That's Abhi. Abhi always asks this kind of question.
So if we're talking about our field, which is cross-cultural management, I would, highlight, and hopefully Salma will have other insights to add after this, right? But much of what we talked about our presentation. So I think understanding cultural differences, recognizing that culture matters, also recognizing, so we talked about these national cultural dimensions, but we also talked about individual level multiculturalism. So to keep in mind that just because you're from a country doesn't mean that you hold the average, right? It's called sometimes the ecological fallacy. You don't necessarily demonstrate the average culture of the country. So there are individual differences. So to recognize that, to recognize your own biases, and to realize that it also can be quite challenging. I think there's a tendency oftentimes in many of the more technical fields to say, oh, that's soft stuff, that's not that important, not a big deal. But I find it very interesting that when I talk with business people and really anybody, one of the things they find most challenging is interacting effectively with other people. So the technical side, yeah, I can learn calculus, this special method, but that interpersonal component is very challenging. And so I think to the extent that people can get really effective training and not just book learning and experiences, and learn to sort of process these things and to be a bit more sensitive to others, and sort of recognizing when someone might be offended or not be offended or has a different approach, and not doing a knee-jerk reaction, can be very helpful. So I would say overall, probably more on interpersonal skills, intercultural skills, and how to work effectively in cross-cultural teams and sort of building bridges can be helpful. Salma, you want to add?
Yeah, definitely adding to that. So a couple of key statistics, especially in the US, the white population is going to be a minority population. In fact, I think it's just turned over this year, right? So you're having increasing globalization, increasing migration, increasing change in the demographics of every country around the world, or most countries around the world. So you're going to end up meeting people from other parts of the world, or at least who have come from different paradigms or perspectives. So one big aspect of the work and the future, working and the future, is the ability to work with others. Gone are the days where technical knowledge was sufficient. Knowledge is not the, the prerogative of just a few. You have everything from Khan Academy to YouTube videos to short-term courses on LinkedIn. The choices available nowadays to enhance your learning is significant along with the internet, and it's easily accessible and much more affordable than it was in the past. What is, in fact, in the HR space, which is another area that I teach in, we find that 85% of the jobs that are going to exist in another 10 years haven't yet even been invented. And if you look historically, this has been the case in the past as well. So how can you then, to Abhi's question of how can you then be equipped in the future, always that willingness to learn and develop whatever skill that you have. So if you are working, for example, as a lecturer that I am at medical, for example, people who are in medicine, there's continuous medical education. If you're an HR professional, you have to get accredited and re-accredited. So this professional continuous development is one side of it, which is the technical or expertise or knowledge. But the thing that's really going to make a difference is your ability to work with others. So one of the, in fact, almost all the variables that we looked at and all the components that we focused on in the study, these are the key skills that you're going to need, especially that aspect, for example, with mediating. When you have different people coming together, if that's going to be the trend, you need to know how to then mediate in terms if there's any conflict, or how do we resolve things when we disagree. And disagreement is part and parcel of life. So getting out there, being open, being willing to step out of your comfort zone, talk to different people, challenge yourself. These are the things that are really going to make a difference for the children, for not just ourselves, but our children and how they adapt to the future.
Thank you for your answers. Now I have a question also. I was thinking, this has happened to me sometimes, so it's my experience, but I always wondered this. So sometimes, even though people are from same culture, say born into same religion or country and having similar cultures, but their thought process is not similar. They're very unique. And the other person gets these expectations that just because we are from the similar culture and language, we speak the same language, we would be behaving the same way, but we do not. So should people react in those circumstances?
Well, this kind of goes back also to what Salma was mentioning earlier in terms of stereotyping, right? So we tend to assume, right, oh, you're from this area, you're like this, which isn't necessarily true. A lot of research talks about individuation. So even with our national cultural dimensions, right, we say this is an average, but it's a first guess, it is a stereotype. But there are individual differences with everything. So it can be helpful to have these views as sort of a first guess, but then you always need to revise it for the individual level. And that also goes back to, people's backgrounds. Even if you are from the same place or same religion, et cetera, there are variations within that as well. So Salma, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
No, I completely agree with what Davina is saying. And you have to understand, in the past, how far did our grandparents move from the space that they lived in? right? So if you're looking at my grandparents, my grandfather never moved out of the village that he grew up in, right? It was my father's generation that then went to the next village to get an education. But look at my generation. My brothers and I, we're in 3 different parts of the world. My children are in 2 different parts of the world at a much younger age. So this trend is just going to continue. So the assumption that because I look like my grandfather, because we're blood related, we have completely different ways of thinking, right? Times have changed, mobility has changed, our exposure to different ways of thinking has changed, and our opportunities to adopt these things have changed. So if you look at globalization in terms of, say, Zara, a market, chains, logistics and supply chains, you can get a Zara jacket in Dubai that you can get in Singapore, that you can get in the US. So there are some things which are, accessible across the board, which weren't accessible in the past. So people's minds have that stereotypical thinking that a particular group is going to behave or act in a particular way. I think really gone are those days. There are probably more outliers in a group than we are willing to admit. I think there's importance in identity and community to say, I have roots. And this is a conversation Davina and I always have, because we both have Indian roots. And then we have these multiple conversations about, so we're supposed to have Indian roots. Are we supposed to think this way or do you think that way? How do you think? Because diversity is pretty much going to be the norm. Whether we look on the physical attributes, if you look at that tip of that iceberg, on the top of it might look like we have something a lot in common. But at the core, I think there's more differences in the way we think, which in all fairness is the best thing that we can happen, because if that doesn't happen, we're not going to get the innovation or the creativity, to be a sustainable species. So we do need that. It's just a question of how do then we bring this together in a way that's constructive for everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answer. So one last question I have, and then maybe we can end. So this question is something where, say, this is also something I have experienced. Say you have colleague from another country, or you have a colleague, even if a colleague who is from the same country or speaking same language, or a colleague who is of another country, but they speak something to you about another race or another culture in a derogatory manner. How to respond? Like, I feel really upset. I am somebody like that who hears something like that and I immediately start feeling upset and it affects me. But I don't want to be that. I instead want to say something and feel better. So, but I don't know what to say, so I don't say. So, if you can have some inputs on that.
Yeah, so there are different approaches to dealing with that sort of thing. And Salma might have a bit more advice, and she's a bit more in the HR side of things. But in general, obviously, knee-jerk reaction of getting angry usually will not help for the other side to learn, right? Sort of calm yourself down, right? And whether it's at that moment or a little later, to maybe say, you know what, you had mentioned this and I felt this way because I feel that, right? Whenever there's some kind of a conflict, instead of saying, you said this, you're a terrible person, it tends to be more effective to be like, I understood this, and this is how it made me feel, and I was upset because of this, and hopefully the person will be willing to reflect and didn't realize that it was derogatory. I mean, obviously in some cases that's not going to be the case, but hopefully for most cases they're just ignorant about it or don't know what the appropriate response would be. So that would be my recommendation. I don't know, Salma, if you have something you want to add.
I'm just smiling because this happens like all the time. So so 2 things. One, there's going to be more and more instances of this as people step out of their kind of sheltered spaces where there's more of the same and they start to interact with people, from other parts of the world, and a big part of it is people don't have knowledge of others or other cultures. So a huge, for yourselves, the biggest thing I would say is understand or get to know, that whole entire slide that we talked about, reducing biases, intergroup contact. You have to have contact on a one-on-one basis with people from different parts of the world or different social groups, whatever communities that they come from. So I would, for yourselves, I think the first thing to do is, and this is a thought exercise that I do with my students in class, is sit down and think about who are your go-to people, your core people, the people that you trust to have your back. Write down those list of names and then think, oh, how diverse is this? Is it the same people from the same community over and over again? If that's the case, if your trusted inner circle is always coming from the same group, then you probably want to expand your network. You probably want to take a little bit of effort to get to know other people from different parts or different social groups to understand. Another part that we mentioned in the presentation is to make those connections out of work. So get to know people on a personal level in a friendly way, right? And that will kind of help you understand people without the pressure of trying to get some job done or get a task done. You get to know people on a one-on-one, on a friendly basis. But in terms of, so that's for the individual, to make sure that you don't stereotype or you don't make quick judgments on people because you've met one person from that group. I can tell you as a Muslim, trust me, I get this all the time. They see me, they put me in a box and they think, oh, great, we've got to be careful now. So it takes a lot of, it takes a lot of, I realized many times that was the first interaction they have with me, maybe the only time they're ever meeting a Muslim or having a one-on-one. So the first point thing is to make sure that you meet as many diverse people as well. So your own prejudice and biases, which you're not going to be conscious about until you actually meet somebody. So then you'll know what your own prejudice and biases are. So that's for your own personal thing. But I think flipping that, now when someone else comes up and says something quite rubbish, the question is to ask why. Why do you say that? What prompted you to say that? Why do you think that? I didn't quite understand. Where did that come from? And many times they themselves don't know where their implicit bias or underlying assumption comes from. And just by asking why, it doesn't have to be accusatory. You don't have to be rude. You can be very blank and simple and say, oh, why do you say that? I didn't quite get it. And just do something as simple as that will stop them in their tracks in two ways. One, they themselves will probably 9 out of 10 times have no clue why they said what they said or thought what they thought. But then the second thing is they now will have to answer to you. And they know that if they come to you and say something else like this, it's not going to fly because you're going to question them. So I think these are two things that'll help. One is to think about yourself and your own prejudice and how you can break that by meeting people from different groups. And then the other one is just to ask why. Why do you think that way? And get them to stop in their tracks so you don't stop in your tracks.
No, they will say that since I am religious, somebody told me like that, since I'm religious, I don't like homosexual people or something like that. So then I mean, then nobody's forcing you to go and do something with homosexuals. Then if it's your religion which is preventing you, then I mean, why are you coming to me and telling that? That's another thing I wonder. I mean, if you are not comfortable, then you just keep it to yourself and then don't come and tell another person that.
So then ask the question, what is it that you want from me? What do you want? Okay, so you've shared this with me. So what was the purpose of sharing it? What is it that you want? And sometimes they think they need a validation for their own stereotype. So just don't play the game. Don't pretend to know the game and don't participate in the game. So they will think twice before they voice those kinds of things. That would be my advice.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really helpful. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, it was a pleasure to be part of the whole thing, to be honest.
Yes, and thanks for the invitation to speak. We hope that, both of you enjoyed it and hopefully others will watch later and enjoy it.
Yeah, I recorded and I live streamed, so I hope people will be watching and people will like it for sure. And it's important. People should watch this. I would say people should watch this.
We think so too.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure.
Thanks to both of you. Thanks a lot. You took your time and did everything. Thanks a lot. Nice
Our
to
pleasure.
meet you. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Motoshi. Bye-bye.
Bye.